And he writes to Fife thanking him for finding these, saying, "The precious relics of Dr. Franklin, which I value not only for their intrinsic value, but whatever came from him, but also because of my particular affection for him." This is by far his favorite person, and Franklin and Jefferson together become the only two Americans who are famous in the world. Franklin is the exact opposite of Thomas Jefferson in so many ways, but particularly in his treatment of books. Jefferson does not write in his books so extraordinarily rarely that we make quite a fuss when we find some annotation of Jefferson. He will initiate his ownership by putting a T next to the J signature and a J next to the T signature at the bottom of the printed page. But there is no scrawling Thomas Jefferson across his page. In fact, you will find very few moments of it. Franklin, on the other hand, so for example, we're not going to find in his philosophy section, "good idea," used in the Declaration of Independence. Franklin, on the other hand, carries on a complete dialogue with every pamphlet that he's reading. Traditionally summarizes his response to every pamphlet at the end, which is most revealing. This one ends, this one is actually the work of Matthew Wheelock, Thoughts on the Origin and Nature of Government, is by Alan Ramsey, in which he says, it's an interesting premise, but it's much flawed by the, in essence, hackneyed approach of this author. But what you're looking at here, it's this phrase right here. It's a section of the dialogue in which the author is saying, well, perhaps at a certain point we might alter the way in which we tax the colonies. And Franklin, who's been impatient through this entire pamphlet, grunting basically in ink, writes, "Why don't you get on with it?" So there is very much a distinctive style between the two of them. But nonetheless, we have Jefferson collecting Franklin, which is very touching. Jefferson organized everything in his collection, including those political tracts that he gathered on an annual basis. One of them, the political tracts of 1774, included this piece right here, which is Jefferson's Some Review, the document that brings him to the attention of the convention and begins the framing of the argument that's going to, in fact, allow us to declare independence from England. Jefferson fell sick. He was actually going to present this as a talk to the House of Burgesses, fell ill, handed it to a friend and asked him if he would place it on table, that is, leave it for the committee to look at. He did not attend the session. He asked the individual if he would read it. He took one look at this pamphlet and said, "I'm not reading this." And instead, it was published by Clementina Rind in Williamsburg, which makes it a triple winner as a rarity of a pamphlet. But it's also the pamphlet in which Jefferson frames the notion, among other things, that the only thing we have in common with the English is that we both live under a tyrannical king. Jefferson is a little unhappy that this is published. As you may have noticed, quite uncharacteristically, he's actually had annotated his name on the front page because they didn't offer any authorship. And there are two extant copies of this pamphlet, identically annotated by Jefferson. So you can feel the tension as he very carefully crosses out every single error in the piece and then goes on to annotate it. To the point that every footnote is corrected. He later in life has this reprinted and sends it off to an individual, reminding him how terribly important and scarce this pamphlet is. But when the library arrived, it came in a bound volume of the pamphlets of 1774. This is how Jefferson is documenting his area of politics. Well, of course, this is the collection that shapes and informs the Declaration of Independence. It's the raw ingredients, in fact. And if you go to the Library of Congress, you'll see a current exhibition which attempts to show what ideas are drawn from the library that inform the Declaration of Independence. Part of this collection is, in fact, the books that he carried with him to Philadelphia. You're looking at the original rough draft of the Declaration of Independence. This is largely in Jefferson's hand. The committee was formed when independency was going to be proposed. This is Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Sherman, and Livingston, all of whom had the very wise counsel of simply asking Jefferson to frame the document. Later in life, he will, in fact, talk about the fact that as he sat and watched Franklin and Adams amend his text 47 times, and then another 43 times, I believe, when they leave committee before the Declaration of Independence is penned and reads the way we remember it now. Nonetheless, this is, in my sense, one of the more important documents that's held by the Library of Congress. This gives me a chance to set straight the misconceived notion that many have that the original Declaration of Independence is at the National Archives. What's at the National Archives is called the engrossed copy. It was done quite a while after July 4th. It was done in part because they wanted an official copy, but also because from draft to the printed copy, only one name shows up at the printed copy of the Declaration, John Hancock, and he was feeling that since this was totally treasonous, he would like a few other names below him. And so they wrote a document that, and asked people to come back and sign. Nonetheless, the reason it's of value to us is that we have moments in which phrasings are changed. Here we have, for example, a moment in which inherent turns into certain inalienable rights. Language that's ever present in our everyday language, visibly being altered in front of us. We currently have an exhibition at the Library of Congress that allows you to do this on screen as well. You can move that bar up and down, and not only will it transcribe into legible type, but it will also tell you who's made the handwritten change. So that under absolute despotism, for example, is added by Ben Franklin. This is the document that's carried across the street on the night of July 3rd to the print shop of John Dunlap, taken to his shop in part because he's about to print a newspaper and has a slightly larger print bed. Copies are printed enough for the members of the committee to take out and distribute to constituents, to read from courthouses and then move on, and to have them reproduced, reprinted and mounted on walls, reprinted in newspapers. We have 2 Dunlap broadsides at the Library of Congress, which is sort of an embarrassment of riches. And to make it even more special, this one happens to be George Washington's copy. Although he was not a member of the committee, he was standing outside waiting to receive this declaration, which was folded up, put in his pocket, mounted on horseback in Philadelphia, and rode to New York so that he could stand on a hill and read to a ragtag group of soldiers that we've just declared war on the greatest power in the history of the world by reading this document. That moment is so intense for the soldiers that that night at the foot of Broadway in Bowling Green, they tear down the statue of George III, and revolution has begun. So remember that the next time you go to the National Archives, you're not looking at the story. If you go through Jefferson's collection, you can in fact find the real source inspiration for many of the ideas that play through the Declaration. Just one example is Lord Kames, who's Henry Home, who writes a work called the Essays on the Principles of Morality and Natural Religion. Holmes is Kame is one of these people who comes from the moral sense school. This is where the notion of the pursuit of happiness begins, the notion of pursuit of happiness begins to emerge out of this. The final category of Jefferson's collection is imagination. It is the fine arts, beginning with the most important art to Jefferson, which of course is architecture. And what you're looking at is an example of what we've begun to do with our digital books at the Library of Congress, which is this is a digital screen, it's a digitized book, you're turning the pages by hand on the screen as you read through it. And this is one of the examples that we have in the exhibition. But you're just as likely to find, some people are surprised to find this, I guess, Phyllis Wheatley's work, although I think this is there largely because he was influenced by Franklin in part, or in other cases, music.